Hello, welcome to this workshop on eliciting and analysing student feedback. My name is Madeleine Marie Judd and I'm the Student Partners Advisor at the University of Queensland. And I'm very fortunate in this role to get to collaborate with so many students and staff from across the university. One thing to disclaim at the very beginning is that this workshop, like any of the workshops that we facilitate, is quite action-packed. We're trying to fit a lot of content into it in such a short amount of time. But me and my colleagues are always more than happy to meet with you one-on-one or with your colleagues as well to answer any questions that you may have or approach ways in which you can enhance the feedback that you collect. So in terms of the structure of today's workshop, there'll be quite a few things that we're seeking to unpack. So all the way from the very beginning about identifying what the purpose of the data collection is, to identifying what are some of the approaches that you may want to utilize to collect that feedback, all the way to analysis as well as feedback and closing that feedback loop as well with your stakeholders. So some of you might be at the very beginning, but we also acknowledge that some of you may be further on that track of collecting feedback. And it'd be also wonderful to hear about some of your successful strategies for collecting feedback as well. Because one of the things that we would really like to highlight is this workshop is just more so based on some of my experiences as well as some of the experiences of my colleagues. So in terms of how to design your surveys and how to facilitate your focus groups, for example, there's a lot more wealth of knowledge that's out there as well. So firstly, I think whenever you're seeking to elicit feedback or perspectives of whether it be students or staff members, but we'll contextualize it today in terms of collecting student feedback, it's really important to identify both yourself, but then so you can articulate it to the audience about what is the purpose of the data collection. So for example, two common rationales for collecting feedback might be research or for continuous improvement. So I typically, categorize research as presenting to an external audience, presenting to people outside of the University of Queensland. So this might be at conferences where you might be presenting that work. It might be submitting a journal article or a good practice article to an external body. Whereas continuous improvement, that's typically only related and bounded to, it might be preparing an evaluation report to identify ways in which you can improve the way in which courses are delivered or in which programs are delivered, for instance. So it won't extend beyond members of the University of Queensland. Now, one thing to flag is that if you're looking at eliciting student feedback just solely for the purpose of research, then you will require ethics approval. So we highly encourage you to reach out to the ethics department as well at the university. Whereas you might be doing both at the same time. So this is similar to the research that we do as part of the Student Staff Partnerships program, where we have surveys, informal coffee catch-ups, as well as focus groups with students and staff members. Is we do it, one, for continuous improvement to identify ways in which the program can be enhanced, but then also we use that feedback as well sometimes to publish to external audiences or to present at conferences. So for us, the purpose of the data collection is twofold. So just to kind of, again, flag that it's not always straightforward. So the second component is to identify ways in which you can actually collect that feedback. So what are your approaches going to be? So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that there are some more authentic and informal ways to collect feedback that might be more appropriate, for instance, especially if you're looking at continuous improvement as well. So you might be a student representative that's sitting on a university committee. You might be a student that's a representative for your whole cohort within your course, for instance. And some of these informal ways can be great opportunities to be collecting a wider and more diverse range of perspectives from some of your colleagues. So a couple of the examples that we have identified here on the slides for you is one of the things that we do in the Student Staff Partnerships program is we have an operational group. And on that group, we have 4 student representatives from different disciplines, different year levels and so forth, that are great touch points for the broader community as well. So a couple of times a semester, they'll hold these coffee catch-ups. Now with the changes impacted from COVID, we were originally planning on having on-campus coffee catch-ups and having vouchers for anyone that attended so that they could share some, free coffee and tea. But of course we had to transition that all to online. So the student reps facilitated informal virtual coffee catch-ups via Zoom as well. And the 4 of them attended it, and it was more of an informal discussion. But that doesn't have to limit you as well. So you might want something that is more structured. You might have a set of questions that you want to address, and that's completely fine as well. I think some of the other considerations to make is how are you reporting that back? So for instance, the student reps in our operational group, we wanted to ensure that that coffee catch-up was a safe space for people to be able to provide their feedback without being fearful that a staff member would be able to identify that they attended that coffee catch-up and they provided that piece of feedback. So the student reps have done this wonderful work of basically creating a Word doc of all of the anonymized feedback that we received, and then we responded to that feedback and then said to them, it would be wonderful if they could then close that feedback loop and share our responses to those challenges or questions that were raised during that catch up as well. So it's really important to not only be collecting the feedback, but then to also respond to it. Otherwise, what's the point in collecting it? Now, another approach is to utilize existing social media platforms, for instance, such as Instagram or Facebook. So you might find that your faculty or your school or even in the central department already has an existing social media platform that a whole host of students actually are followers of as well. So in the Student Staff Partnerships team, we did create a Facebook page. It's still only a small number of us as well because it's people that have actually participated in the program. And we had administered a poll, as you'll see on the screen there, of how did people want to engage in this online community? What were some of the posts that they wanted us to place on our Facebook page? But I know that, across the different faculties, and for instance, it's a great illustrative example, the Haas faculty, the student representatives did some great work in utilizing existing social media platforms, in particular Instagram, to be posting a bunch of the top really difficult questions to check the pulse of how students were currently feeling. And it could be anything from, teaching quality to study supports for students, as well as, trying to see if students still felt that sense of connection with the university. And those can be great ways where it's not a massive time commitment for people to be providing their feedback, but you're still getting a broad segment of the student, hopefully a broad segment of the student population that are able to do these multiple choice types questions as well. So just to also flag that whilst today we'll be running through some of the more formalized types of feedback strategies such as surveys and focus groups, to also think more so outside of the box, and how can you actually leverage social media platforms or other places and spaces where students go to elicit feedback. So just to flag that on this slide here, it's a very crude generalization of some of the pros and the cons of surveys versus focus groups. So generally speaking, in terms of surveys, they can be a shorter time commitment for participants as well. So one of the great things, whenever you're using things like SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics, they'll give you an indication of how long that survey should take to complete. And, typically I have found in the past that's, usually around a 7 minutes time commitment, whereas more kind of semi-structured focus groups or interviews may take an hour. And then you just think about it from the participants, from the participants' point of view, especially if, if it's done in a face-to-face type of environment, they need to travel there and travel back. So it's always more than 1 hour to facilitate that focus group. So because of that time commitment, especially for the facilitator as well, because they might need to go to the focus group room earlier to make sure it's all set up, and then they never just go for an hour. So, you know, closing off those conversations as well. There's generally more ability to collect a larger sample size if it's a survey as well, because people can do it complete it in their own time, and it doesn't take as long of a time commitment for the researcher to be collecting that as well. So typically you can get a larger sample size from a survey as well. The great thing with surveys as well is that you can quite readily get some great quantitative data, and particularly again with platforms such as SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics, they actually can provide some really great visualizations, especially if you're asking people to rank, you know, on a Likert scale as well. It can provide some nice visualizations, whether it's pie graphs or tables and so forth. Whereas what I find very beneficial about those conversations between people, those focus groups, is that you can get some great qualitative data and some wonderful quotes from people, and you're actually able to follow up with questions, especially if you're unsure by what they mean, or if they've just given you a very brief response to the question as well. So why not have the best of both worlds and triangulate the data? So typically how I like to structure it, doesn't mean it's the right way, but it's just worked for me well in the past, is I like to start with a survey, especially if I'm not too sure of what the questions are that I want to ask. So in that, I include both Likert, which I'll explain a little bit later, and short and long response questions as well. And in that, I might have more broader questions about, you know, what are the key challenges, and, you know, what are the best bits? What are the bits that need improvement? And then from that, I'm able to narrow down and identify what some of those key themes are. What is the most frequently, you know, what is the top 3 challenges that students are currently facing? Or what are the top 3 things that are working for them at the moment? Then I lead into a focus group. And that gives me time to then narrow down my question set, because, you know, if you only have them for an hour, it's really difficult to, and again, we'll be discussing that a little bit later on, but it's really difficult to narrow down and strategically choose what questions that you want to ask them during that time. So based on the key themes that emerge from the surveys, you can then narrow that down for the focus groups. And then another really important thing to do is to compare and contrast the data from the surveys and the focus groups and see if there were any discrepancies between the 2 data sets. Does it tell you a different story? And for instance, you know, is that because of the, you know, the types of students that were participating? Did you have different students participate in the survey as, you know, you had participate in the focus groups? Or did you have a much smaller sample size, you know, a smaller number of people participating in the focus groups and the surveys? It's really great to kind of start answering and unpacking some of those key questions as well. Now, also just a flag, that can be a lot. And if you're doing this, you know, in kind of more of a volunteering capacity as well, that's a lot to accomplish and takes a lot of time as well. So, you know, when I'm going through some of these strategies and bits of advice, kind of take it with a grain of salt and pick and choose the things that you think will work for you in your current, I'm going to call it your current research project as well. So I mentioned a Likert scale, and a lot of you will already know this, but I just like to flag it as well, because, you know, we do get this question quite a bit from some people about like, well, what is a Likert scale? So a lot of you would have seen it, especially in your student evaluations of courses and teaching. And it can be, you know, a 5-point scale or a 7-point scale. And basically, you know, it'll ask you a prompting question and you're supposed to tick either, you know, anywhere up from 1 to 5. Now on this next slide, and it's taken from this Simply Psychology website as well, which you can access via this link, there's a range of different types of response sets that they call it. And this would vary, and I found this text to be quite useful actually, because sometimes when you're creating that survey, it's difficult to know what the reliable words are to use in this particular situation, and that aren't too like emotionally based as well. So this, depending on, you know, what you're looking at evaluating or researching, it can really vary. In terms of what I've used in the past, it might be that agreement level, which you saw in the previous slide, or it might be awareness level. I think especially at the university, awareness would be more so with respect to like those central type of programs, such as student staff partnerships. A person might really want to investigate, do students actually know what this is? And finally, you know, another really important one might be satisfaction as well. And especially with the higher education sector moving to performance-based funding, and a lot of the evaluations that occur as well of universities, satisfaction is one of those key kind of criteria as well. Okay, so what are some useful platforms to use if you're looking to do a survey as well? So one thing to note is SurveyMonkey. I've had a bit of experience with it and I've loved it. I found it quite useful to use and quite user-friendly, especially with someone that's not so great with technology. Some of the limitations of it is that you have to, you can have a free account, but it is quite limited in its functionality. So for instance, when I've last used a free account, it was, you couldn't ask any more than 10 questions, and it does cap the number of participants, the number of respondents of that survey as well. So that would be something that would be worth investigating, especially if you're looking to get like, you know, over 100 or a substantial number of responses to that survey as well. Qualtrics is another platform, and great news that as of recording, so it's really important to check if you're watching this later, is currently UQ has a license for Qualtrics for both staff and students as well. So it can be free. Now, just to flag that, I'm saying that on the 5th of June, 2020. So definitely type into Google UQ and Qualtrics and just see, you know, if it's something that's still available, or feel free to reach out to the Student Staff Partnerships team. Now, when the university license a platform, you know, it's potentially a lot more secure, the data as well, and it includes all of the key functionalities that you would potentially require as well. So definitely investigate that if you're looking at doing a survey. Another useful strategy that has been highlighted by some partners that we've collaborated with. So Francielle, one of the student partners we've collaborated with, created or conducted, I should say, phone surveys. And so, but that does require, of course, knowing the numbers of the people that you're seeking to reach out to. So she actually found that it was a great response rate. She received about 60 or so % of respondents replied to that. Whereas with surveys, you know, it can be around 30% or so people actually respond to it, or sometimes even lower as well. So it's really important to think about, what do you want your sample size to be? How many people do you want to respond or provide their perspectives as well, and to factor that into it. Some other great platforms which I mentioned earlier as well is social media platforms such as Facebook or Instagram. They do have that type of, you know, polling or survey functionality in there as well. So definitely, you know, a great strategy would be to do a bit of an audit or a stock take about existing social media platforms at the university. So does your school, does your faculty, or does that central unit have existing social media profiles? And can you collaborate with the administrator of that platform, of that particular group, to host a poll, for instance, as well? So if you're a student representative on a committee, can you collaborate with one of the staff members on that committee to basically get to collaborate with respect to identifying those contacts that might be vital to get onto that Facebook or that Instagram account? Okay, so how do you actually develop your question set for surveys and focus groups? Now, one of the really important things to do, which I briefly touched upon earlier, is to narrow down what are the themes that you want to address, because you might have a whole host of questions that you want to ask, but it's quite if you've only got people's attention for 5 minutes or an hour, you can't get through all of the questions that you want. So you have to be really strategic about, okay, what is this survey? What is this informal chat? What is this focus group really going to focus on? Is it going to deal with online learning? Is it going to deal with teaching quality or the study supports available for students or their connection to the university, or what the gaps are currently for students? Or is it to do with assessment as well? Now, especially if you're a student representative, again, I really encourage you to reach out to members or an ally on the committee or the working group in which you serve and help to identify and narrow down what those topics or what those themes are going to be as well. And that can be your best person to help you make sure that you get that on the agenda as well, especially once you have collected that feedback. You want to make sure that you have time to formally present the findings and the key recommendations to that committee as well. Okay, so for surveys, what are some of the questions to include? Definitely, I always encourage for demographic information. So you know what types of students or what types of respondents are actually participating in that survey. So for instance, if you're looking at a specific discipline, you want to make sure that, like for instance, if you're within the engineering discipline, you want to make sure that it's only engineering students that are responding to that survey. Because whilst the perspectives of students from another discipline are really important, your focus is specific to this particular discipline. So you might want to include questions on gender, on year level, what is their program, and you know, are they domestic, are they international, things like that. So basically you can, you know, once you're reviewing the responses, you can see, oh, you know, it's only domestic students that have been responding to this survey. So you might want to make more of a concerted effort and target, you know, some of your kind of recruitment strategies specifically around international students so that it's more representative of the student cohort within your discipline as well. I also like to have a mix of Likert questions and qualitative response questions, because qualitative response questions, of course, takes a significant amount of time for people to really reflect on, think about, and then type up. So having some of those, you know, really quick to answer questions is quite good, and it can be easier to also analyze the responses from those Likert questions as well, because then you can kind of find out, you know, that median or mean satisfaction levels, but then the qualitative response questions enable you to do a bit more of a deep dive and really identify not only what the key challenges are, because it doesn't restrict people from a predetermined list of challenges, but also potential solutions as well. Just to kind of skip back a little bit to demographic information, especially if you're including demographics such as age range, I really encourage you to utilise the classifications outlined by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, just because that's legitimate and quite a valid measurement tool to use it against. Finally, I always like to have an any other comments be the very final question, because there might be some things that you had forgotten to or didn't identify as something that's particularly important. So it potentially provides respondents with the opportunity to provide feedback in which you weren't identifying as important at that time. And I have actually, that has enabled me in the past to go, oh, actually, I missed a big area there. So it's important to include that question, a question responding to that in future iterations of the survey. So language is really important whenever you're designing and developing survey or focus group questions. So in the past, especially with respect to the SSP program, I've asked questions like, what are some of the needed improvements of the program, which has provided great feedback, really useful feedback for what we can do differently. And you might want to go away from more like emotionally laden text, such as what is wrong with the program, because you want people to be part of the solution, not just to identify everything that's really bad about it, but to also, you know, draw upon their perspectives, because they probably have some wonderful insights and some wonderful ideas about what could be done differently. Now, from SurveyMonkey, one of the suggested questions could be something like, how helpful or unhelpful do you find X to be, rather than how awesome do you think X is. So it's really important to show that you don't have, you know, any bias, that, you know, you already think that this program or this course is awesome. So, you know, why would people have any critiques about it? So it's important as much as possible to make sure that your verbiage is as neutral as possible. And one of the ways to ensure this, because sometimes you don't realize it yourself, is to always rely on a peer reviewer or peer reviewers as well. Someone that is happy to look at your question set and be quite critical in a constructive way about different ways that you could phrase that question or those responses. So when developing focus group questions, it's really important to ease participants into the question set. So not to go straight to what needs to change with this program or what are some of the needed improvements, but you might have the first couple of questions kind of being more contextual, more, you know, please introduce yourself, so you can get more of a understanding of who that person is. And it's a lot easier, of course, as a participant to answer a question such as that. It you know, makes people a lot more comfortable in that space. And it's a wonderful opportunity, especially when you're running a focus group with a few people in there, and they might not know each other as well. So it's a great opportunity for people to form connections with one another. I typically say keep the questions at 10 maximum, because especially if you're doing a focus group in an hour, that can be a lot to get through. And you want to make sure that people just don't answer it at a surface level, but they're actually able to go and, you know, provide really comprehensive feedback. And you also want to make sure that everyone in the room has the opportunity and the space to contribute to the conversation as well. I always like to test out my questions first. So as I mentioned before, it might be, you know, sharing a Google Doc with a colleague and getting them to provide feedback. But then you also might want to, you know, offer your friend a pizza and just ask and see if you can ask them these questions. And when you actually go through that process and you actually verbalize the questions, people can actually identify, oh, that question made no sense, or, you know, that question actually should have been asked a lot earlier or a lot later. And sometimes after you've done your first focus group, you don't, you know, it's really important to go back and go, okay, how was that structure? Do I need to change things, or do I need to tweak the words a bit? And, you know, I've done that time and time again. It's also important for yourself to have a few prompts up, you know, in your sleeve, just in case people aren't providing really comprehensive feedback, or they're being a bit short and just saying yes or no. So you might want to ask something like, you know, can you give me an example of that? Or, you know, tell me more about that. That sounds really fascinating. So really, yeah, encouraging them to go into further detail. And again, despite the fact that it's only 10 questions that I generally ask, and, you know, 1 or 2 of them is more introductory, the last question I always leave as an any other comments. And that might be, again, because you're missing a vital question and people really want to contribute, you know, their perspectives about something in particular that hasn't been addressed yet. Or it might even provide that opportunity for people that, you know, have thought about something that was asked earlier and they want to add more to it at the end. So again, yeah, it provides that final opportunity for just to close off. And I have typically found in a lot of the focus groups that I've run, people quite commonly take you up on that. It's quite rare for people to say, no, I'm all good, thanks. But then you've still provided them with that opportunity. So facilitating focus groups. One of the really important considerations to take into account is, are you actually recording the session, or are you just taking notes of some of the key findings? So if you're doing it for research purposes, I always encourage recordings to be made, especially because that legitimates it a lot more as well, and you can take those wonderful quotes and then use them for research purposes. But for continuous improvement, we've also recorded sessions in the past. It's really important to give your participants plenty of notice so that it's actually, when you're recruiting them, they already know that it's going to be recorded as well. So I typically have, a couple of audio recording devices. I always recommend to have two, because it's happened to all of us. But, there was this one time where I had one audio recording device there and I had fresh batteries in it, and then halfway through the interview it carked it. The audio device, wasn't working anymore. So it's really important to have two just in case that happens. And I always face the audio recording microphones away from each other as well, especially if you're in a room, if you're back to that face-to-face kind of focus group environment, and people are around a round table, that if someone's a softer speaker, for instance, that the microphone's a bit closer to them as well. At the beginning, it's also really important to reaffirm the purpose of the focus group. So you would have already provided that context in an email or via your other recruitment strategies, but people have a lot on their plates these days, and they might have forgotten what specifically this focus group was about as well. And again, it just provides that opportunity for people to get comfortable with the space, especially if you're facilitating the focus group in a meeting room, for instance. And when you're reaffirming the purpose of the focus group, I would kind of provide a little bit of context about, how many questions you're going to be asking, what's the structure of it going to be, and what the feedback is going to go towards, and how you're going to close that feedback loop. So again, be really specific about that. Also, to provide that opportunity for everyone to introduce themselves and to provide, a little bit of context, and it gives you as that facilitator some further information about, who the people are in the room and what their levels of expertise are or what their experiences are. Also, as the facilitator, it's really important to ensure you're kind of responsible for ensuring that everyone in the room has had the opportunity to contribute, because sometimes you might have really passionate people in the room and they don't really provide the space for everyone to contribute. So some ways to handle that include, definitely affirming what they've said. So, you might say something like, thank you very much for contributing those perspectives. Jo, what are your thoughts about this? So again, opening up that space so that person can contribute. And finally, it's really important to acknowledge and thank people for taking the time out of their busy schedules to provide their insights. And again, as I mentioned earlier, to identify to them how you're going to close the feedback loop. So it might be something like, we're still facilitating a range of focus groups over the coming weeks. So you're not going to hear from us straight away, but at the conclusion of that, we will send you an email outlining the key recommendations that are being proposed at this committee, again, so that they can see where their feedback has gone. And I think with, whenever you're eliciting feedback, trust is really important. So if you commit to something, if you say you're going to provide feedback by a particular time frame, do it. Otherwise, get back to people and just let them know, be transparent that, there's been some challenges along the way, that you've needed to facilitate more focus groups, or those meetings were cancelled, or, life has been crazy and you won't be able to undertake that feedback loop immediately, but you will get on it as soon as you possibly can. So one of the things to also consider, especially if you're facilitating a focus group or one of those informal catch-ups online via platforms, it's really important to ensure that you're security conscious. So some key recommendations that that have been identified include password protecting your session, only having the host access to screen share as well. And then also to be careful what you post on social media. So for instance, don't post the Zoom ID and the password on social media, but have people email you and then you send them the ID as well, or send them an Outlook invite as well. And that just really ensures that, you know, only the people that have the right intentions and are around the room are there as well, and it prevents you from being Zoom bombed as well. So focus groups can be quite dry, and some of the feedback that we've received in the past is, you know, a lot of people don't want to participate in focus groups, whereas informal chats might be better. But if you're looking at focus groups or doing workshops, there are some great tools to make it more engaging as well. So for instance, the Student Staff Partnerships team, we're pretty late to the game. A short time ago, we came across Jamboard, which is an application within the Google Suite. And it's a wonderful way to elicit people's feedback. And it's more visual. It provides people an opportunity to provide anonymous feedback as well too, because their names aren't necessarily associated to it. So basically on the screen that you see right now, you'll see a blue sticky note. And we utilize this particular Jamboard for a community of practice workshop that we held, in which we were eliciting feedback from our community about what types of training and development they would like for student partners, staff partners, and student reps. And people contributed, as you can see on the screen, various sticky notes about some of their ideas. And they also added stars to signify that they agreed with someone else's idea as well. Another platform that we've utilized is Padlet as well. And that can be a wonderful way. Again, it can provide anonymous feedback. This was used for that very same community of practice workshop meeting that we held. And as you can see, we had 3 overarching questions. A couple of good things about Padlet is that you can like someone else's comment. It's part of the current licensed platforms that UQ currently has for staff and students. So you can create a free account with your student or staff ID, which is great. But one of the things that I would really recommend with Padlet is to make sure that you turn the notifications off as well whenever anyone comments on that Padlet as well. Because for instance, we've utilized this for inductions in the past. And at the end of the induction, we've gone back to our emails and noticed we've had, you know, about 100 notifications from Padlet. But again, those different types of platforms can be fantastic ways to be eliciting people's feedback in a bit more of an engaging way. So it's not so much looking at a Zoom screen. And it's anonymous as well. So if people, you know, if you're dealing with a topic that people don't feel as comfortable voicing their perspectives, it provides another safe platform for that. Okay, so how do you recruit the participants of your study? And especially I think there's more challenges for us to recruit participants, especially because we can't rely on those face-to-face strategies that we may have in the past. So firstly, it's really important to utilize your existing social networks. So if you're a student representative, for example, there are a range of other student representatives throughout the university. You might sit on a committee with a couple of other student reps, and you also have the staff representatives on your committee as well. And if you have, you know, allies within that committee, definitely collaborate together and utilize your own networks as well. So for instance, that staff member maybe have a contact with the administrator of the school or the faculty social media page, and they can be a great way of facilitating that introduction between the two of you. They might also know if you're looking more so in the teaching and learning space, they might know of some great course conveners or tutors that are happy to email their student lists or to write a post on Blackboard, for instance, to get the word out there about your feedback forum as well. Also, you will know a bunch of students within your courses. So another kind of strategy is to even develop a slide that you could ask your course conveners whether they'd be happy to include a slide at the end of the lecture or at the end of the tutorial, to share with your cohort as well about this feedback opportunity. So again, just try and think of, who are your allies within this space, that you can leverage their connections as well. Also, as I kind of mentioned, there's Facebook and there's Instagram. Identify those social media platforms that you might be able to get the word out there. And finally, is emails. Not always the most effective strategy, but especially if it's a targeted group of people and you're able to obtain those email addresses, maybe sending, a BCC email to everyone about the opportunity to participate in this feedback forum, and being really explicit about the purpose of that feedback forum. So some key strategies or tips to consider when recruiting for participants is it's really important to be super explicit about what the time commitment is. So if it's a survey and Qualtrics says it will take approximately 5 minutes, include that in your call out to people. Say it will only take them 5 minutes. If it's an informal coffee catch up, is it only an hour? Also about what the data is going towards. So is it to improve the way things are done here at the university, or is it for research? To be really explicit about that. And also about who's accessing the data. So is it just yourself and a couple of colleagues? And if so, be sure to specify that. People will be potentially a bit more comfortable if they know who's going to be reviewing that type of data, especially if it includes any kind of sensitive content in there as well. Also, is it going to be an anonymous or de-identified? So for instance, if it's a survey, making sure that you don't ask their student numbers or you don't ask their email addresses, so that it can be anonymous. And also, who can the participants contact if they have any questions? So including an email address of somebody and what their name is and their role here at the university, so that if people want to participate but they can't participate in that particular day, can they reach out to you? Or if they need to all of a sudden cancel their participation, again, having that person, that central contact person that they can reach out to. It's also really important not to either advertise or organise any of your feedback forums during student milestones such as exams. So, in the lead up to exams, I wouldn't be advertising a feedback forum or have a feedback forum, because of course people need to prioritise those milestones as well. And then also to think about, reflect on, and be explicit about what are the incentives for participation. Is it, if it's on campus, if it's face-to-face, is the coffee going to be provided? Is it going to be a pizza party? Or is it more of those intrinsic kind of motivations about enhancing the way things are done, having their perspectives heard, and, contributing their perspectives as well? So I would brainstorm all of the possible incentives that people would, identify through participating in it, and then be explicit about that whenever you're sending those emails or you're creating those social media posts to get the word out there. Okay, so one of the really important things, so say for instance, you have sent out your survey, you received all the responses, or you facilitated the focus group. And now you're at the stage of kind of, drawing it all together, unpacking what the key themes are, and then delivering recommendations. One of the most challenging things, especially when you're quite close to the subject matter, is how to provide unbiased recommendations. So it's really important to make sure that you differentiate between what's your opinion and what is the data telling you. And sometimes, especially when you're doing types of, action research where you're also like a participant throughout the way, it's difficult to distinguish between the two. Or, you might really fundamentally disagree with what the data is telling you, but you have a responsibility to be representing that accurately. So one of the key things that you'll need to think about is how representative is the feedback of the overall student population. So for instance, did you only get 10 respondents and there's 50,000 students at the university? Or are you looking at a cohort of 500 students and 450 students participated in that research as well? And again, when you're developing that report or those recommendations, to identify what the response rate was, how representative was it of the overall student population, and to be really explicit about any limitations of that research there might be. So say, for instance, it could be things such as, during the process, what was identified was that it was only international students that were participating in this research. So, the next steps would be to ensure to elicit the perspectives of domestic students. Or it could be, things such as, only 10 people responded to this survey. So further work needs to be done in eliciting the perspectives of a more representative range of people as well. In terms of structuring and writing your report, I think firstly it's really important to understand who your audience is. Is it members of the senior executive of the university? Is it to your student colleagues? Who is it? And in terms of that, then, adapt the language to accommodate that audience as well. Now, a report can sometimes be really boring, and sometimes people think, do people actually even read it? One of the recommendations from a previous one of these workshops that we facilitated, Michelle recommended for like a one-page infographic to be created. So that could be a wonderful way and an engaging way to capture the findings and the recommendations from your research as well. So don't feel like you always have to be confined to writing a stuffy report as well. You can create an infographic, you could create a presentation as well that you end up presenting to that committee or that working group, or you can do a report. And I'm sure that there are a bunch of other ways to illustrate those findings and recommendations as well. I think it's always really important to have someone peer review your work as well. I think, everything that I do, whenever I'm doing any piece of written material, I'll always have a colleague peer review it. And that's a wonderful opportunity to get that feedback. And sometimes, when we're reading it and it makes sense to us and someone else reads it and they say, I have no idea what you're talking about. So draw upon, your networks as well and see if a colleague can peer review it. One thing to consider, it's not always necessary, but do you want to have a literature review section and connect some of your key findings to existing literature? Again, just something to think about whether or not you want to incorporate. And another really important thing is the flow of the ideas. How do you actually want to, if you're writing a report, how are you going to structure that report? A way in which a logical way that makes sense in my head, at least, there's plenty of other ways, is I generally like to have like an executive summary, so a one-page kind of overview of the whole document, so that, if people only have 5 minutes to read this document, they only have to read the executive summary, an introduction which provides context about what the purpose of this research was, or in the circumstance of an evaluation that we've just had done in our space, we provided context of student-staff partnerships at the university as well, just to kind of set the scene of how it's evolved at the university. Then a methods section to detail what methods did you do surveys, did you do focus groups, how many questions did you ask, what was the time commitment involved. Then to have a findings section, so how many people responded to the survey or participated in the research, if you obtained that demographic information, what types of people participated in it, and kind of, if you can, compare it to how representative of that particular cohort of students is that group of people. So, was it 10 people out of a cohort of 1,000 or so forth? And then I would have a recommendation section. So either based on your analysis of the findings or the recommendations of the participants, what are the key recommendations that you would make to address that challenge or those challenges as well. One of the things that we've just recently done in an evaluation report, which I really liked to include, was a response from the people that lead the program. So for instance, we had an external evaluator, Francielle and Brooke, undertake the evaluation of our program, and Naima when she was a student. And then they completed the evaluation report, and then we had a section at the very end, which was a 1 to 2 pager, which detailed let's say the 5 recommendations and our responses to those recommendations. So it could have been things like, unfortunately, we can't complete this at this time, but we will prioritise that particular recommendation in semester 1, 2020. Or, we've already done this, or, this work is currently underway, types of responses like that. And then that can be a wonderful way to then share that back with the community of people that even participated in the research, so that they can see that not only were their voices and their perspectives heard, they've been acknowledged, and that feedback is going to be enacted to various extents as well. So I think that can be a wonderful way to close that feedback loop with the participants and to ensure that you maintain that trust with that community as well. And finally, just context is always really important as well. So kind of, as I mentioned before, what was the purpose of this research, or where did it kind of emerge from? So one of the things that I mentioned is closing the feedback loop. So each semester we try to send out a "you said," "we did," or "we will do" email to all members of our community. And because in the Student Staff Partnerships program, we elicit feedback in so many different ways. I can't tell you how many surveys we've got, how many focus groups we've run, but then also more of those informal conversations or anecdotal feedback. And we do a high-level table listing all of the feedback that we've received. And I've just taken a little tiny screenshot from some feedback we received back in 2019. And then we detail what we will do or what we've done in that space. Again, I always highly encourage that if you're eliciting feedback, you need to ensure that you respond to that feedback as well. Now, here is a link, and we'll include it in the body of the YouTube account as well, of a survey from this workshop. I would truly appreciate any feedback that you may have to further enhance this workshop as well. And this is really, one of the first times we've run this particular workshop, so we would truly appreciate any feedback that you may have, and we'll take it into account for future iterations of the workshop in the future as well. So some next steps to consider. Again, we'd love it if you could complete that survey so we can identify ways in which we can improve. Also, if you haven't started drafting your questions as well, definitely do that and test them, see if you can identify a peer reviewer. The Student Staff Partnerships team is always happy to help out as well, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any further questions, and yeah, always there to support. You may be a member of our Student Staff Partnerships community and have a Student Staff Partnerships community of practice. We hold these workshops meetings 2 times a semester, and anyone from our community can raise topics, raise issues that they want to discuss with your colleagues as well. And we also co-facilitate these meetings with members of our community, both students and staff members. So please don't ever hesitate to raise an idea, raise a topic, or if you want to collaborate with us in facilitating one of those meetings, you're more than welcome to. As I've mentioned, and please feel free to take a picture of this particular slide as well, there is a wealth of existing knowledge out there about how to design good survey and focus group questions, how to facilitate them, as well as what your next steps are after that. Now, on this slide includes just a small sample of some of those resources. I found these to be particularly practical as well. And they're anywhere from, 1 or 2 pages all the way up to 40 or so pages. But they're great basic, like foundational blocks whenever you're starting that journey as well. And I'd just like to thank you all once again for joining us today. Again, you're more than welcome to reach out to us via our email account, ssp@uq.edu.au. And yeah, I wish you all the best, and I hope you enjoyed today's session.